So, first of all, let me introduce myself. As you can see, my name is Tracy Carmack. I have a Bachelor of Science in Bacteriology, and I work for a microbiome lab, which is great. I get to use my bachelor's degree. Not many people get to do that when they have something that specific. I'm also a certified clinical nutritionist and a traditional naturopath. My husband still practices as a naturopath, so I get to hear some firsthand clinical experience with these products, and it's great. Okay, and next slide. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. In 2013, my father passed away, so I came up to Idaho to take care of his ranch, and he had several things, barley, alfalfa, and wheat, and hay growing, and so we got some cows. And what I started noticing as I met the neighbors is that there were a lot of people with cancer. And so about 8 out of 10 of my neighbors had some kind of cancer. So, being the scientist, I started looking for a causative factor. And I realized that the farmers on 3 sides of me were spraying glyphosate in the form of Roundup. And for wheat crops, they were spraying about 3 times because there's a short season up here, and spraying the wheat will help dry it so it desiccates it, and they can harvest it earlier before the fall snows. So then I realized in the back of our house, we live on the border of the state forest, and I went back there, and this is what I saw posted on the trees. So what they do is they aerial spray Roundup from the air, of course, and they do that to kill the underbrush so that they can bring the logging sleds down and clear cut the trees. So what that means is that I had Roundup sprayed on all 4 sides, and unfortunately my father had pumped the water for the house that I live in from a runoff pond. So I found out I was bathing in Roundup for about 3 months until I was able to get a well drilled. And so I did some testing on myself, and lo and behold, I had some Roundup in my tissue. But I found out also that almost everyone has Roundup in their tissue, even infants, fetuses, or newborns. Their cord blood has Roundup in it. So we'll talk more about this, but just know that this is one of the most damaging things to your microbiome and to the Earth's microbiome. And that's really what led me to Microbiome Labs. I was looking for answers to how to revitalize the soil on the farm, as well as some science to go toe-to-toe with the U.S. Agricultural Department, the co-ops, the land-grant university, and the local physicians that were lecturing in the local town that Roundup was so safe that you could coat your tongue with it. So I started on my crusade of finding out what we could do to help stop this damage that was happening to our human microbiome as well as the Earth. So the first thing to realize about our microbiomes is that it's very complex. We know more about the surface of the moon than we do our own microbiomes. Since the end of the Human Microbiome Project and the American Gut Project, we know a lot more about how our organisms survive, how they get along with each other, and what it really takes to get past the harsh gastrointestinal barrier of our stomach acid, our bile salts, and our pancreatic enzymes. And we find out that unless you're in some type of spore, an endospore like our spores and MegaSpore, you're going to succumb to one of those 3 gastric barriers. So what Microbiome Labs has done is take these spores that are natural in the soil And they were in our ancestral diet. They were on our vegetables and our fruits. They were consumed normally with our food. They were in the environment. They would, through quorum sensing, find the upper intestinal tract, begin to colonize, and do all the great things that they do in our GI tract. And then they would pass out through the fecal material that would be put back onto the gardens. The vegetables would be harvested again, and this cycle would continue as it had since the dawn of man. But since the Industrial Revolution, this cycle has stopped. And that's why we're seeing so many gastrointestinal problems and chronic illnesses that start in the gut, where the portal of health is. So we're going to look at some characteristics of a healthy gut. And what you see here are three primary areas we're going to focus on. The first is the mucin 1 layer. And this looks like a large swimming pool of different organisms that are color-coded to represent the vast diversity. So the more diverse a microbiome is, the healthier a microbiome is. And you can see that there is lipopolysaccharide floating around. This is the most toxic of all the endotoxins, but in this ideal situation, it's absorbed in this mucin 1, so it's diluted, and the secretory IgA is also attacking it, neutralizing it, arresting it, so it's not causing any problems, and that's the benefit of a healthy mucin 1 layer. The second primary area is this, what we call the keystone strains. So these are the initial inoculum you received from your mother. There is no such thing as reseeding or re-inoculating a microbiome. The keystone strains came from your mother. That's the Akkermansia, the Faecalibacterium prunitii, and the Bifidobacteria species. Those are the three most beneficial, and we know the individuals that have more of those organisms have less health problems. So that's the second area of focus, is to help those keystone strains thrive. The third area is mucin 2, and this is a thick gelatinous barrier that helps protect the underlying epithelial cells here. You can see they're very healthy. They've got the microvilli with a nice uniform brush border. The junctures here, we hear a lot about the tight junctures. They're tight. They're sealing anything from passing into the lumen, which is here. And you've got some immunoglobulins floating around, patrolling the area, looking for foreign invaders. So again, this is the ideal situation where everything is working as it should, with tight, distinct barriers and protecting, the lumen of the cell. This is what most of us as practitioners are dealing with. And here is a representation of leaky gut, otherwise known as metabolic endotoxemia. And the list over here on the right are all of those things that cause the breach in the gut barrier. We know the devastating effects of antibiotics. And unfortunately, antibiotics not only wipe out everything, but they selectively wipe out more of the bad than the good. So that is why C. diff, strep, staph overgrow so easily, is because they're not as affected by antibiotics. This list here of alcohol, smoking, stress, lack of sleep, those are things that we do to ourselves. The intense exercise, many times as we're trying in our efforts to be healthy, we can over-exercise and cause oxidative stress, which damages the microbiome. This category here really represents all of the artificial, synthetic adulterants that we have added to our food supply. We have artificial sweeteners here, which are more harmful, really, than natural sugars. But this also represents the synthetic fats, the colorings, all those, the GMO, not GMO, but MSG. GMOs are also on this list, however. Saturated fats. Now, Typically, saturated fats are very healthy for us, but in a situation where you've got a leaky gut, it is not good. And you'll want to hold off until you introduce saturated fats until after you have helped this person heal their gut. And the reason is because lipopolysaccharide will use saturated fats to make an even more toxic endotoxin. And then we have listed here glyphosate, but again, this represents the whole group of herbicides and pesticides. And we can add a lot more to this list. Oh. Sorry about that. Okay. The other things we can add to this list are a whole host of other pharmaceutical drugs, GMOs, and vaccinations. Now we put these two representations side by side so that you can clearly see where the most damage is occurring. And that is where the lipopolysaccharide is degrading this mucin 2 layer and irritating to the point of destruction of these epithelial cells, where the zonulin will now open up the floodgates and lipopolysaccharide floods into the lumen of the cell, where the immune cells recognize it as a foreign invader. An immune cascade then takes place until you have a situation of raging inflammation. And this is what we want to repair. So now we're going to look at some research that clearly associates the disruption of the gut microbiota with chronic illness. So the first paper we have is looking at how the diversity affects the dysbiosis, which is associated with obesity, inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and colorectal cancer. This paper also brings out the concept of intelligent modulation. And that is, we already know that the bulk of our immune system is in our gut. But now we're starting to realize that the bulk of our neurotransmitters are also in our gut. And more papers now are coming out with the association of emotional and mental illnesses associated with the beneficial gut microbiota and a healthy, intact gastrointestinal system. This is another paper clearly making that connection between the microbiota, a healthy microbiota, and being able to prevent irritable bowel disease. And then the inverse is also true. When you've got dysbiosis, you're going to have much more irritable bowel because of this reduced bacterial diversity. And we talked earlier about keystone strains, and this is one of the primary ones. It is Akkermansia mucophylla. As you can see from the genus name here, it's a mucin-loving organism, so it helps protect that mucin 2. It's inversely associated with obesity, diabetes, cardiometabolic disease, and low-grade inflammation. So the more you have of this organism, the less of those chronic illnesses you will have. Two other things that are important about this organism is that it is a fat-burning organism. And in a country which has a lot of obesity, this is very important to help this organism thrive. And it thrives when we're not eating. And so this is going to emphasize the importance of intermittent fasting in order to help this organism thrive. The other product that we've introduced specifically feeds this organism, and that's in our prebiotic, and we'll talk more about that. The other keystone strain that's of great importance is Faecalibacterium pranisii, and this organism is associated with anti-inflammation. So the more Faecalibacterium you have, the less inflammatory bowel disease you have. Now we're going to talk about a few papers that associate chronic illness with the dysfunction of the mucosal barriers, those mucin 1 and mucin 2 layers. So the first is highlighting how important our gut intestinal barrier is to protecting us from autoimmune disease. So think back to the diagram where the lipopolysaccharide was flooding into the lumen of the cell. What also floods into the lumen of the cell in a damaged gut is undigested food. So our immune system is supposed to just be recognizing the building blocks of our food, such as amino acids. It's not supposed to be attacking the undigested food particles such as peptides and peptones. But when there is a breach in this intestinal lining, that's exactly what it's doing. And that is the genesis of autoimmune disease. I mentioned earlier about the intelligent modulation, and this is a paper describing that very link, where you've got the translocation of lipopolysaccharide that is linked to the inflammatory pathophysiology of depression. And this is one of many papers that you're going to see now that the emphasis, they're looking for how many mental illnesses and emotional dysfunction is associated with our gut. This is a paper that's linking the digestive illnesses with the epithelial barrier function, such as GERD or acid reflux. And unfortunately, the way it's currently being treated is with proton pump inhibitors, which is exacerbating the system. This is the last paper, but this is very important. Many people don't realize that AIDS is actually a severe case of metabolic endotoxemia. The reason is because the virus attacks the CD4 memory T cells of our gastrointestinal tract. And when this function is knocked out and you're not able to distinguish self from non-self, then there's a severe mucosal immune dysfunction that progresses to AIDS. So we've talked about all of the bad news. Let's talk now about the good news. What can we do about damaged gut layers? What we've introduced is the Total Gut Restoration Program. It's focused on the 3 areas of reconditioning, reinforcement, and rebuilding. And if we think back to our diagrams, that mucin 1 layer, this is the first area that we are supporting, and we're doing that through MegaSpore. And its primary function is to help this diversity of the organisms, because this is what's going to be your long-term protection of these mucin layers, is making sure that all of these organisms are in a nice thick layer so that they're able to arrest the lipopolysaccharide and allow the immune system to do its job. The second area of focus is this reinforcement. And this is where we're feeding the keystone strains with the prebiotic. And the third is rebuilding that mucin 2 layer that's been damaged and eroded away with the mega mucosa. So we've introduced these 3 formulas, and we're going to go over individually what their characteristics are and how they function. And then we'll talk about how do we put these together in protocols based on how your patients or clients respond to them. So the first formula is MegaSpore. And I had mentioned before there's 5 key spores. Each one of them individually are pharmaceutical drugs. So we've got 60 years of experience in Europe and Southeast Asia on using these spores. Now, a very important characteristics they have is quorum sensing. All organisms have quorum sensing, which is a chemical surveillance system that tells them where they are, who's in their environment, how many there are, and what species. The difference is that MegaSpore is like a general hierarchy quorum sensing, such as it's a general among infantry or a principal among elementary school children. And so what it's able to do is when it passes through the stomach acid unharmed and the pancreatic enzymes and the bile salts. It finds its way through quorum sensing into the upper intestinal tract. Again, this chemical surveillance system, it surveys its environment. If it finds a pathogen, it custom builds an antibiotic specific for that pathogen and comes out of the spore form locked and loaded. So this is one of its ways it's able to cause a microbiome shift and by forcing out the pathogens, and then it's going to start feeding the commensal organisms. And it does this by producing the full spectrum of B vitamins, including methylated folate, vitamin K2, which is menaquinone, and this quinone is going to help the mitochondria of the good organisms, so it helps in the division. It also produces digestive enzymes. That's why we take probiotics while we're eating. It also produces antioxidants. But very importantly, it helps with short-chain fatty acid production. And this is important because that is the fuel that mitochondria use. And so by helping the division of these keystone strains, MegaSpore can increase the diversity of organisms by 40%. Now, what was very important to find out as a manufacturer is how much does MegaSpore help heal the gut? And that answer was published in August of 2017 in the World Journal of Gastrointestinal Pathophysiology. But in that study, not only were they able to determine how much gut health improvement there was, but they also found that it helped many other analytes come into significance. And each one of those are now a standalone human clinical trial. And the reason is because of the importance of lowering triglycerides. So now we have a lipid study. It also lowered insulin resistance. So we have a diabetes study. It lowered ghrelin. So we have a weight loss study. And it lowered specific inflammatory markers that help with Hashimoto's and rheumatoid arthritis. So once each of these studies come to a conclusion, we will have the most researched probiotic on the market. And this is very important in establishing proof and evidence for your patient population. Now back to the healing aspect. What we found is that MegaSpore in the treated population was able to reduce lipopolysaccharide by 45%. And this is hugely significant, especially when you see this was done in a 30-day period. We also discovered, it was a bit of a surprise, but that the untreated population, the placebo group, continued to increase in metabolic endotoxemia after this challenge of a high-fat meal, which, by the way, was a McDonald's breakfast. So the difference between these two populations was a significant 60% difference, which is huge when you consider the time frame, but also the amount that you will be able to impact chronic disease across the board. So the second step is that prebiotic for helping the keystone strains. And the reason we selected very specific fibers to be in this formula and why we call it a precision prebiotic is because it only helps the Akkermansia, Faecalibacterium, and Bifido species and does not feed the pathogens. And it took us a long time to find these fibers because we wanted them to be specific for the commensals and the keystone strains. So the research shows that the FOS, which is derived from kiwi skin, increases Faecalibacterium by 100% in 4 weeks, increases Akkermansia mucophylla by 8,000% in 5 weeks. The GOS derivative increases a subset of bifidospecies by 67% in 1 week. The XOS increases the other subset of bifidospecies by 21% in 4 weeks. So as you can see, this is a huge impact on those keystone strains, which ultimately
Did
are
you use the kiwi fruit?
The skins. It was the kiwi skin. There's fibrous FOS fibers in the skin of kiwis, a golden kiwi.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. And then the last step in the total gut restoration is the formula Mega Mucosa. And there's 3 primary ingredients. The first is IgG 2000. And if you're familiar with this product, it's been on the market a long time. It's a serum-derived, concentrated immunoglobulin. It has IgG, M, A, and D. It helps to neutralize lipopolysaccharide. It also tags viruses and parasites so that IgA can work better. So it helps modulate the immune system. It also has a concentrated citrus polyphenol that helps squelch the oxidative stress that is released during the immune cascade. And then the final ingredients are a specific set of amino acids that help the goblet cells create more mucin 2. We chose this selection of amino acids based on this study here, where threonine, serine, proline, and cysteine help increase the colonic mucin 2 synthesis by 95%. So this is going to make a huge difference in helping to repair that mucin 2 layer of protection. So here's where we have the total gut restoration with all 3 of these formulas. For 80% of your clients, you'll find that titrating up MegaSpore is going to tell you a lot about how damaged their gut is and how dysbiotic their gut is. If they're able to titrate up in the 3 weeks, the first week is 1 capsule every other day, the second week is 1 capsule a day, and the third week is the 2 recommended capsules, and you're always administering these during their largest meal. Then you'll be able to add one of these 2 powdered formulas, and you'll do one at a time, the first at half a scoop for a week, and the second at a full scoop, and then you'll add the second powder at a half a scoop for a week, and then a full scoop for the next week. Typically, you'll have your clients on these 3 formulas for 3 months. You'll let the powders run out, and then you'll maintain with just MegaSpore 2 to 3 times a week. This will be sufficient for about 80% of your clients. So there are going to be those 15 to 20% that are very sensitive. And we have other tools and protocols to help them. For instance, for those that have a difficult time tolerating MegaSpore, it's because they have either several pathogens that are kicking off a lot of lipopolysaccharide, and lipopolysaccharide is the root of all die-off. And it is in large numbers, it will shut down the bowels and cause constipation. If there's a lot of gut damage with exposed epithelial cells, lipopolysaccharide is very irritating to those exposed epithelial cells, and it will cause diarrhea. And there's a whole host of other symptoms, from foggy thinking to gas, bloating, cramping. So at that point, if they have too much damage and they're not able to tolerate MegaSpore, a person would probably introduce Mega Mucosa first to pre-treat the gut and allow that mucin layer to build up so that there's not going to be the irritation to the gut from the lipopolysaccharide. Some individuals will mix the 2 powders once they've started them one at a time. They know that they can tolerate both. They'll mix them and they'll just sip on them through the day. After this gut restoration was launched, we launched an anti-candida product called MegaSpore. And the reason is because many people do not realize that they have candida until you start a system of gut repair. And candida does not want to be evicted from its home, and it will start manifesting in several different ways. You can recognize candida on the tongue through a condition called thrust, or in the scalp through dandruff, or on the skin with hives, vaginitis, itchy anus, foggy thinking. There's a lot of manifestations of candida, and it can really get in the way of repairing the gut, especially if an individual has a lot of mucus in their stools. So you may need to introduce the MegaSpore to get the candida under control so that these other great formulas can be more effective. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here so that you can ask questions.